2020 presidential election coverage starts now. So here is the JHK map. It's a map I love. It shows the latest polls up to the hour. The entire map filled out. You can see the dark red states are states that are basically tipped to go toward the Republicans. They're very strong Republican states. And the blue states are the ones that are strong Democrat states. We then have some toss-ups here. We have leaning or likely Republican, likely Democrat, and sort of leaning Democrat states. And so this is where the forecast currently stands. If you believe that the polls are 100% accurate right now, and you believe that the election in 45 days' time will reflect the current polls, then you would conclude that the Republicans will win 204 electoral college votes come election day, but the Democrats will win 319, and therefore, which is more than the 270 you need to win the presidency, and therefore Joe Biden will be the 2020 president. Some people think, well, there's polling error, there's other things involved, etc., and that all factors in. But some people think, well, there's a silent voter here. Remember in 2016, the Democrats in the polling averages were tipped to win states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, Pennsylvania, etc., and these states started to tip Republican, and that's because there was an uncounted vote. There was a sort of a silent vote for the Republicans. Now, in a series of other videos, I have examined in detail some of these scenarios. For example, what would happen if the silent voter is about 5% of the voting population? What about 10%? What about 15%? In the note section just beneath this video, you can find the links to all of those videos, and I encourage you to see them, and they have the full videos fleshing out what would happen in each of these scenarios. But in this video, what I'm going to do is just go through very quickly the JHK map that you can see, as well as what we finally got for that 5%, 10%, and 15% scenario. So as you can see, if you're sitting there, you're a Democrat, you're looking at the polls, you're saying, I trust these, as the Democrats do with these polls, then you are very happy right now because you're looking at this map and you're seeing 319 electoral college votes for the Democrats, and that means that you're going to win the 2020 election. But there are Republicans sitting in the comment section below who think, well, look, in 2016, the Democrats also thought they had states such as Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan in the bag, and that these states turned because there was a silent voter. If you believe that, then I've gone through and I've done the 5% silent voter scenario, and here's what it looks like. There it is. So if you have 5% of the voting population silent voters, so leaning Republican basically, so there's an R+5% total. You go from this JHK map where the Democrats are sitting happy, got big smiles on their faces, Republicans massive frowns on their faces, and suddenly it inverts. Now the Democrats are frowning and the Republicans are looking at this going, what? Because with a 5% silent voter scenario, if that's what you believe, that means that that means in the election in 45 days time, actually Donald Trump's going to win re-election, because what happens, as you can see, is that with a minimal case of a 5% silent voter, Pennsylvania is flipped over. North Carolina ceases to be sort of neutral or a toss-up state. It becomes a Republican state. Florida, previously considered under the polling average data a Democrat state, flips again to a Republican state, which is exactly what it did in 2016. And Arizona, right now tipped to be a Democrat state, particularly because the demographics of Arizona are changing quite a bit. Phoenix, they have one of the fastest growing cities and regions in Arizona right now in the United States, so the demographics are shifting very fast. So there is a very strong case to be made that it is a Democrat state, but with a 5% silent voter in Arizona, Arizona now becomes, today, with the poll data we currently see, it suddenly becomes a Republican state. And Republicans win with 9 votes. Now, in 2016, Donald Trump won 306 electoral college votes. You need 270 to win. Under this 5% silent voter hypothesis, with the polls as is, the Republicans are not doing as well as they did in 2016, but they are winning the electoral college, and therefore Donald Trump continues on as president in 2020. That's with a 5% silent voter scenario. So you may be asking yourself, well, what about a 10% silent voter scenario? Especially if you're a sort of a Republican who thinks these polls are just completely out there, and that 10% Republicans combined with sort of independents or in the middle were voting Republican, and those who are sort of leaning left but independent dropping out, etc. All that adds up to 5. I've even seen people say it adds up to 15%. Well, if it adds up to 5, you have 279 electoral college votes. If it adds up to 10, you're sitting at 325 electoral college votes. So if you believe that 10% of the voters out there are not responding properly in the polls, or just simply dropping out, and they're silent Republican voters, maybe they're saying they're Democrats, maybe 5% of them are saying they're Democrats, and therefore, that drops the Democrat vote total 5% and then adds 5% to the Republican vote total. It's basically an R+10 scenario. Well, the Republicans are now sitting at 325 electoral votes, which is significantly better than what they did in 2016, where, if you remember, they won 306 electoral college votes. So if the silent voters 10%, particularly in these swing states, what happens from that 5% scenario is suddenly Minnesota flips over. It used to be a Democrat state under an R+5 scenario. Remember, this is the JHK poll forecast. This is the R+5 scenario. But even from here to the R+10 scenario, suddenly Minnesota's flipped over, Wisconsin's flipped over, Michigan has flipped over. So that's like the top end of the Rust Belt. Minnesota's not really the Rust Belt. There's an Iron Range up here, but the Rust Belt is flipping over. Pennsylvania had already flipped over. So what's left of the Rust Belt? Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. But Ohio's already red. Indiana's already red. What else has happened here? Nevada, considered right now a strong Democrat state, under an R+10 scenario, flips over and becomes a Republican state, if you can believe that. Colorado, it looks like it's been reduced from a sort of likely Democrat to sort of tilting Democrat. Same for VA. And what else has gone on here? It looks like New Hampshire has now tipped over to a Republican state as well. So this is the R+10 scenario. Under this scenario, the Republicans are sitting there with 325 electoral college votes, and Democrats are at 213, so Republicans are well above the 270 threshold to win. This is the R+5 scenario, and this is the JHK model. And now let's move on to the R+15 scenario. That's what it is. So it's a complete landslide for the Republicans. So if you remember the R+5 scenario here, let's talk about how it's changed. Actually, let's go to the R+10 scenario and talk about what the changes are here. So there's R+10, Republicans at 325 electoral college votes. Under R+15, which meaning that there's a 15% silent vote, Oregon flips from being a Democrat state to being a Republican state, if you can believe that. New Mexico flips from being a Democrat state, solid Democrat really, to a Republican state. And Maine as well flips from being a Democrat state to a Republican state. I believe Maine in the 2016 election was a Republican state. So we get there for the Republicans, but only with a R+15 silent vote. So you need 1/6 of the population essentially, not discussing their votes for Maine to flip over like this. But that's what an R+15 vote scenario looks like. Here you have Democrats sitting at 175 electoral college votes, which is not good for the Democrats, and you have the Republicans sitting at 363 electoral college votes, which is a landslide. I mean, you don't really hit 400 electoral college votes, which is the sort of the landslide figure that everyone would agree is a complete landslide. But you do get to 363, which is well over, what is that, 60 plus 30, that's 93 votes above what the Republicans would need to win the presidency. With an R+15 scenario, they're now not at 270, not at 300, which is 30 points above, but at 363, which is another 60 points above. They're 93 electoral college votes ahead of winning the presidency in an R+15 scenario. So just briefly, here's the JHK model, here's R+5%, here's R+10%, and here's R+15%. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and if you did, give it a like, give it a follow, give it a subscribe, and thanks so much for watching.